Genesis 50. Do you know what the 5 stages of grief are? Here's a hint. It's up on the board. This is a model for grieving that psychiatrist Elizabeth Kubler-Ross came up with through her work with terminally ill patients. The 5 stages are denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. Now, some people think that they happen in order, but in reality, we can bounce around between these stages depending on the situation. Now, I don't share this to teach this tonight, nor are these stages absolutely true. They're only a theory made from observations. Grief is more complex than assigning labels or stages to it. Because often we can be angry and in denial, or we can be bargaining and depressed, and so on and so forth. So there are mixtures to this theory. But what can often happen in grief is that our feelings can be expressed towards other people. For example, we can be feeling anger that a loved one is gone, but that's difficult to process, and so we end up expressing that anger by becoming mad with a family member or a friend. It's not that we're really angry at what they did, although in the moment it feels that way. No, instead they can become a focal point for our anger of someone being gone. The same thing can happen with bargaining. Sometimes we think that if we could have just taken our loved one's place, it would have been much better for the world. Take me, we think, and let my loved one live. This feeling can get misdirected too, as we turn that bargaining into wanting to hold on to something of theirs at the expense of someone else. Maybe the loved one gave a picture to a family member, but suddenly we want it instead, and this ends up being a fight over things. Now, yes, situations like this can be attributed to other reasons, but one of them may be just misdirected grief. And I thought I'd open with the stages of grief tonight rather than asking about our experience with funerals or the loss of loved ones, because while some of those memories can be sweet, some of them are bitter. And in the midst of grief, even if all goes well with the funeral and the inheritance and the will and everything afterwards, the best we can really hope for is bittersweet. And you know, one of my sacred honors as a pastor is to be with people in these times. These moments are sacred moments. They're times when we're intensely aware of spiritual things. You know, some of my hardest moments, but also some of my most treasured moments, is when I get to walk with my family through these times. I've officiated my Aunt Kathy's funeral, my Uncle Steve's funeral, Katie's Aunt Linda's funeral, and a close family friend's memorial service. And they're difficult times, to be sure, but it's a time where I'm honored to speak the gospel into those moments. Now, these things come to mind today as we look at Genesis 50 tonight. We're going to see intense grief. We're going to see a family in turmoil. And we're going to see another death. What we'll witness is what we could see even today. After all, when a parent dies, siblings can fight. Maybe because of misdirected grief, maybe because of something else. But into this situation, we're going to see an important truth spoken, one that ties directly to the gospel and to our faith in Jesus Christ. So let's read Genesis 50, starting in verse 1. This is what it says. Then Joseph fell on his father's face and wept over him and kissed him. And Joseph commanded his servants, the physicians, to embalm his father. So the physicians embalmed Israel. 40 days were required for it, for that is how many are required for embalming. And the Egyptians wept for him 70 days. And when the days of weeping for him were past, Joseph spoke to the household of Pharaoh, saying, If now I have found favor in your eyes, please speak in the ears of Pharaoh, saying, My father made me swear, saying, I am about to die in my tomb that I hewed out for myself in the land of Canaan. There shall you bury me. Now, therefore, let me please go up and bury my father. Then I will return. And Pharaoh answered, Go up and bury your father, as he made you swear. And so Joseph went up to bury his father. With him went all of the servants of Pharaoh, the elders of his household, and all the elders of the land of Egypt, as well as all the household of Joseph, his brothers, and his father's household. Only their children, their flocks, and their herds were left in the land of Goshen. And there went up with him both chariots and horsemen. It was a very great company. When they came to the threshing floor of Atad, which is beyond the Jordan, they lamented there with a very great and grievous lamentation. And he made a mourning for his father 7 days. When the inhabitants of the land, the Canaanites, saw the mourning on the threshing floor of Atad, they said, "This is a grievous mourning by the Egyptians." Therefore the place was called Abel Mizraim. It is beyond the Jordan. Thus his sons did for him as he had commanded them. For his sons carried him to the land of Canaan and buried him in the cave of the field of Machpelah, to the east of Mamre, which Abraham bought with the field from Ephron the Hittite to possess as a burying place. After he had buried his father, Joseph returned to Egypt with his brothers and all who had gone up with him to bury his father. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, "It may be that Joseph will hate us and pay us back for all the evil that we did to him." And so they sent a message to Joseph, saying, "Your father gave this command before he died. Say to Joseph, please forgive the transgressions of your brothers and their sin, because they did evil to you. And now please forgive the transgression of the servants of the God of your father." Joseph wept when they spoke to him. His brothers also came and fell down before him and said, "Behold, we are your servants." But Joseph said to them, "Do not fear, for am I in the place of God? As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive as they are today. So do not fear. I will provide for you and your little ones." Thus he comforted them and spoke kindly to them. And so Joseph remained in Egypt, he and his father's house. Joseph lived 110 years. And Joseph saw Ephraim's children of the third generation. The children also of Machir, the son of Manasseh, were counted as Joseph's own. And Joseph said to his brothers, "I am about to die, but God will visit you and bring you up out of this land to the land that he swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob." Then Joseph made the sons of Israel swear, saying, "God will surely visit you, and you shall carry up my bones from here." So Joseph died, being 110 years old. They embalmed him, and he was put in a coffin in Egypt. All right. So this chapter picks up immediately where chapter 49 leaves off, and we see that Jacob's burial is told in great detail. More detail than any other burial that we've seen in the book of Genesis, except for maybe Sarah's burial in chapter 23. We know that the other brothers were there with Jacob because he had just gotten done blessing them and giving them the command to bury him in Canaan. But who is singled out in verse 1? Joseph. His grief is especially mentioned, and the three things that he does shows just the depth and the sincerity of his grief. His pain seems greater. See, they had been close for the first 17 years of his life. They missed 2 decades of time together, and they spent the last 17 years or so together. They had a close relationship, and Joseph had been especially blessed by Jacob in both chapters 48 and 49. But also remember the promise that God gave to Jacob from Genesis 46, verse 4. When Jacob was wondering if he should go to Egypt, this is what God tells him, starting in verse 3. He says, "Then he said, I am God, the God of your father. Do not be afraid to go down to Egypt, for there I will make you into a great nation. I myself will go down with you to Egypt, and I will also bring you up again, and Joseph's hand shall close your eyes." See, God promised Jacob that Joseph would be there, be by his side at the moment of his death, that he would be able to close his eyes. And so here we see the fulfillment of that promise. And what did Joseph command his physician servants to do? Embalm him, embalm Jacob. And how long did that embalming take? 40 days. Now, it's important to point out that Joseph's position was so great that he had his own doctors looking over his health. Now, I was interested in what embalming in ancient Egypt was, and so I thought I'd describe it a little bit to you, at least from my research of what I found. So if it's too much information, if you don't like squirmy things, you just plug your ears right now. But what they would do is they would remove the brain through the nose, and the removal of the insides through an incision in the person's side, and they would put those into jars. And then the empty head and stomach area were then filled with spices, and the entire body was treated with saltpeter, which is a common name apparently for potassium nitrate, which is the primary ingredient, by the way, in gunpowder. And they did that for 7 days. So for 7 days, they were quite explosive. Then the whole body was washed with palm wine, covered with pitch, and wrapped in white cloths, and laid in a mummy case. Now there's only 2 people in all of Scripture that is said to have been embalmed. And that's Jacob and Joseph. This was the only feasible way to transport them to Canaan in death. If Jacob wasn't embalmed, even if they left for Canaan right away, the body would be decomposing. And that would happen a lot faster in a hot desert climate, which they were in. And Joseph especially would need this treatment, as it would be over 400 years before he, between his death and before he would be brought back to the land of Canaan. And how long did the Egyptians weep for Jacob? 70 days. I mean, so great was their affection for Joseph because of all that he had done for them and how he had led them through this great famine, that they also weep for his dad. And so Jacob, too, was held in high esteem by them. Even though he was a foreigner, and Egyptians historically detested foreigners and avoided them, they honor him here. They weep for him. And so after mourning for Jacob for over 2 months, it was time to fulfill Joseph's command to bury him in Canaan. But Joseph doesn't bring his request to Pharaoh himself. Notice in verse 4 that Joseph spoke to the household of Pharaoh, meaning Pharaoh's servants or possibly family members. Now he may be thinking of how Pharaoh would respond if Joseph himself asked this. That Pharaoh would be worried that Joseph was ready to leave Egypt now that his father is dead. And so to counter this, he asks others to bring the request for him. I mean, if you hear someone else come to you and say something like, this guy's dad asked him to bury him and so in his homeland, and so we should go let him do it, it's a lot different because it's easier to stomach. The focus isn't on Joseph, it's on Jacob. Because if we would hear instead from Joseph, I need to go back to my homeland and bury my father, the focus is on Joseph. And so it's just it's showing wisdom on Joseph's part to just waylay the fears of Pharaoh. And we see in verses 4 and 5 that there's a quotation within a quotation within a quotation. Jacob is quoted by Joseph, who is quoted by Pharaoh's household. But this serves to strengthen the request. Jacob had made Joseph to swear this. This is an oath that he said he would undertake. So this wasn't a rash oath or a rash request even. Jacob had made preparations for his burial himself. He was the one who had dug his own grave. And so the request is presented last. Let me please go up and bury my father. And to set all minds at ease, Joseph adds the promise that he will definitely return. And does Pharaoh deny the request? No. He gives the royal permission. Telling him to go up is just a natural thing to say because the mountains of Palestine are higher than the mountains of Egypt or the land of Egypt. And by receiving Pharaoh's permission, Joseph shows respect for his position. I mean, Joseph is ranked as second in command, right, throughout all of the land. He's second only to Pharaoh. He had to guard against any impression of acting without Pharaoh's knowledge or his say-so. He didn't want to undermine his authority. And there was a huge number of people who went with Joseph. Servants of Pharaoh probably refers to his chief members of the court. Elders of the household refers to top government officials. All elders of Egypt means any who held any leadership position. And the entire family of Jacob went too, save the children, the caretakers, and the flocks. So there's probably somewhere between a few hundred to a few thousand people on this journey. And such a crowd would need protection, right? Especially with all of these leaders. If all these leaders got wiped out, who would Pharaoh have left to help lead the country? And so verse 9 tells us that chariots and horsemen went too. Now the word chariot also means wagons, and is probably referring to what they needed to carry the provisions with them. And the horsemen is the military protection that they had. And in case that we didn't get it, we're told that this was a very great company. The place where this funeral train came to a standstill was the threshing floor of Atad, meaning the edge of this place, which is close to the Jordan. And when they stop, what do? Yeah, they mourn. They mourn for another 7 days. And their mourning is described as very great and grievous in the ESV. It's described as loudly and bitterly in the NIV, and it's described as great and very sore in the King James Version. I mean, so public was this mourning that the Canaanites took notice. And considering the number of Egyptians in this place, along with their military presence, it's probably good that they did take notice of their mourning. Otherwise, they may have feared an invading force. As a result of seeing this grief, they gave a name to the meadow that this all happened on. They called it Abel Mizraim, which when translated means the meadow of the Egyptians. And the interesting thing about the name is that the word for meadows and the word for mourning is almost exactly the same. In fact, these little markings under these letters here are the vowels. And so if we took these vowels away, they're the exact same word almost. They look exactly the same. And just a little trivia for you, if you're ever on Jeopardy and they ask you this, this is how the Hebrew language was originally written. No vowels, just consonants. So, just a little. So they came by and they're like, well, we want to make sure that no one mistakes these words, and so let's add vowels under it so we know what we're actually saying here. So it's just an interesting trivia fact for you. Anyway, so mourning and meadow are almost the same. So Jacob is buried, and he's asked, just as he was asked to be, and everyone returns to Egypt. And after that, they all lived happily ever after. And, okay, no. Joseph's brothers become worried. Verse 15 tells us that they saw that their father was dead. Now, of course, we know that they had known this for at least the last 3 months, 2.5 months of mourning, travel to Canaan, another week of mourning, and travel back to Egypt. This was quite a long time of knowing what has happened. So what this means then is that they realized that their father's death ended any possible restraining influence he had on Joseph. So they worry, essentially, that Joseph is going to take revenge on them. The possibility existed that Joseph has been quietly harboring a grudge for the last 17 plus years. All the brothers feel this way, it says. Although, except I think Benjamin, most likely. After all, he wasn't a part of what they did to Joseph. Now, do you think Jacob actually gave this command before he died? I don't think so either. There's some commentators who contend that he did, and others who contend that he didn't. I don't think he did. If he did, Jacob would have had no problem telling it to Joseph himself. But the brothers feel guilty. And because of their guilt, they suspect Joseph feels angry towards them. And so I think this is a good time to point out the effects of sin in our lives. When we sin, we feel guilty for that sin, and it can cause us to view other people in a different way, in an untruthful way. This is why the enemy wants us to sin. For example, when someone is prone to lying, they are more apt to suspect other people of lying to them. When someone is committing adultery, they are more apt to suspect their partner of unfaithfulness. Sin has that effect of making us feel guilty, and that guilt makes us to start looking for and assuming sin in other people's lives. This is why Jesus, I think, tells us to remove the plank from our own eye before we remove the speck of sawdust in the other person's eye. We need to be able to see clearly to do that. And because of the brothers' guilt, they suspect Joseph of sin, that he's been harboring this grudge, that he's about to take revenge on them. And so they lie and try to manipulate Joseph. We have never seen them openly confess their sin to Joseph or to Jacob. Joseph did hear them say their sin when he was pretending to not know who they were, but never had they talked to him openly about it. But at the very least, even in their manipulation, they are asking for forgiveness, and they are stating that their actions toward Joseph was evil. So in a roundabout way, they are taking that step that they needed to take. But I think they're doing it in how their dad would have done it when he was younger. They were doing it through a scheme. And what is Joseph's reaction to this at the end of verse 17? He weeps. He weeps. Now maybe this is because he finally heard them say that they know they did evil and that they need forgiveness. Or maybe it was because he was sad that they were resorting to old tricks to fix the situation. Or maybe it's because he realized that their question meant that he hadn't made it clear enough that all was forgiven. Maybe all of the above. But after the message is given and Joseph weeps, his brothers come to him and they humble themselves before him. They're willing to be his servants. Their sorrow and their repentance is genuine. They're hoping to bury the hatchet. And then Joseph takes his revenge. Okay, no. No, he immediately calms their fears. He knew that God had everything in control and guided everything. He trusted God so much that he was willing to accept how his life worked out and simply relied on the faithfulness of God. He wouldn't change the events. He wouldn't punish his brothers for the things that God had caused to happen. This is what Joseph meant by saying that he wouldn't take the place of God. He's admitting that he was not wise enough, that he is not all-knowing, that he is not all-powerful. And then he follows it up with an important verse, an important sentence. Look at verse 20. It says, "As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive as they are today." Man, isn't that an amazing verse? I mean, it's a powerful verse, and here's why. First, this verse colors everything that happened to Joseph. His brothers were jealous of him when he had dreams, but God used that to save people. His brothers sold him into slavery, but God used that to save people. Potiphar's wife falsely accused him, but God used that to save people. Joseph was forgotten in prison after interpreting the baker's and the cupbearer's dream, but God used that to save people. Over and over again, God used what was meant for evil for good, and because of that, people lived. But this verse is bigger than just the lives of Joseph and his brothers. This is almost the theme verse for the entire book of Genesis. Adam and Eve rebelled against God, but God would use this for good by eventually sending Jesus so that through him, all who believe would live for eternity. What Adam and Eve meant for evil, God used for good. Cain killed Abel, but God used that for good, teaching us what true worship is and what sin desires to do to us. The whole world was evil, that God wiped it out with the flood. But Noah and his family were preserved, and a promise was given that he would never flood the earth again. The people rebelled against God's command to disperse over the earth, and instead they decided to plant and make a tower to reach to the heavens and to try to make their name great. And so God dispersed them himself, and on, what was meant for evil was used for good. But even outside of Genesis, this verse is bigger than just the theme verse for the book of Genesis. We could look throughout the whole Bible and see this truth repeated over and over again. But we especially see it at the crucifixion. The people killed Jesus. They meant it for evil. But God meant it for good, to bring, as Genesis 10 verse 20 says, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive as they are today. And so this verse should give us hope. Hope that no matter what bad thing we may be going through, God means it for good, will use it for good. And I think this takes faith and trust and especially perseverance. Perseverance like what Joseph had here. This conversation is happening at least 37 plus years after he was sold into slavery. Pray for that kind of perseverance, a perseverance that can last decades. Joseph knew that this was all meant for good, and so he tells his brothers not to fear and that they will be provided for personally by him. He comforted them. He spoke kindly to them. And then Genesis closes out by detailing the end of the life of Joseph. He lived 110 years. Now, his age shows that the span of human life was slowly shortening. Isaac lived 180 years, Jacob 147, and Joseph 110. Although we do see throughout the Bible that there are a few who lived for a little bit longer than this. And during these years, he had the blessing of seeing 3 generations after him develop from both Ephraim and Manasseh. And when Joseph was about to die, he spoke to his brothers. He had provided for them throughout his life, and so he emphasizes that even though he is dying, God himself will provide for them, one who's greater than Joseph or greater than himself. And just as Jacob did, so did Joseph. He makes them swear that they would bring him up to the covenant land. Then he died, and he was embalmed, and so we see the initial steps of keeping that promise. So we've come to the end of Genesis. And even though it seems like it is complete in itself, it also leaves us wondering what happens to the nation after this. We naturally want to continue on, which we will do when we look at Exodus coming up here in the winter time. But let's just look at a few of the lessons that we've seen in the book of Genesis. These lessons, we sometimes think, wow, they're probably throughout the whole Bible. They're presented to us right away in the very first book. We learn of creation. We see the Trinity. We see attributes of God. We see the institution of marriage between a man and a woman. We see that there are only 2 genders, male and female. We've seen the sanctity of life. We've seen the promise of God. We've seen the utter sinfulness of mankind. We've seen how sin is passed down to each person. We've seen how sin separates us from God. We see how we can't overcome sin on our own. We've seen that sin leads to death. We've seen the continued failure of mankind to fully trust and obey God, but that God continues to show his love and his faithfulness to us anyways. We've seen numerous references to the coming of Christ and God's ultimate plan of salvation. We've seen God make and vow to keep his covenant with Abraham himself. That it wouldn't be reliant on Abraham or anyone else, but reliant on God. We've seen God's grace on display throughout this entire book. We've seen that obedience glorifies God. We've seen so much, it's almost difficult to name it all right now. But there have been so many lessons from this book. I hope that we've learned to search and treasure the Scriptures to learn more about God and His will for us. It's been 3 years that we took 2.5, 3-ish years to go through Genesis. You've now read through the entire book of Genesis. We only have 65 more books to go. By the time I'm done, we'll have read every single book out loud here in this sanctuary. But this is oh no. This is the book of Genesis. Any questions, any comments, any insights into chapter 50 or into the entire book? Joseph, yeah. Yep. Yeah. Yep. All we know, I'll just point you quick to something. Dennis was wondering if his brothers were all alive. Exodus 1, verse 6 says this: Then Joseph died, and all his brothers, and all that generation. And so just the way they put that together, it seems that his brothers died after him. So... Uh-huh. Yeah, they might have been worried that he wouldn't come back, so all the leaders were there to make sure he would. No, but I also think it's because the leaders so respected Joseph. You know, would you imagine that today? I don't think we could really imagine that today, that there would be such a respected leader in America that all of Congress would go with them to mourn somewhere. Yeah. Any other thoughts or insights into Genesis? It's true, that's the greatest picture of forgiveness that we can really just grasp a hold of. Mm-hmm. Right. Gracia is wondering if Jacob ever found out about what the brothers did. And I don't know. You know, we see how Jacob brings back like Reuben's sin of sleeping with Bilhah, and brings back Simeon and Levi's sin when he's giving the blessings. But we don't see in the blessings anything said of what they did to Joseph. Yep. Yeah, for Joseph to say, "Am I in the place of God?" Oftentimes we want to be in the place of God, especially when it comes to giving out judgment or payback or revenge on what someone has done for us. And Joseph's like, this was all from God, and he was content to just accept it. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, Gracia is saying that if Joseph always would have said that, you know, going through prison, Potiphar's wife accusing him and then going to prison and forgotten about. I don't think so. Yeah, I think he would have, those things were to help him learn as well, you know, to help humble him. Yeah, and showing his hand through it all. Joseph kept up his integrity through those things, you know, but I think he was also needing to have his eyes open to how God was working in those situations. And that's probably one of the harder things for us. We can't always see or really understand how God is working in a situation. we need to come back to trusting in him even when we can't see. All right, so next week we're going to pick up, we're going to look into equipping, training, discipleship, and spiritual disciplines. We're going to do that throughout the fall. And then we'll join back with Exodus starting in the winter. So January 5th, I think, is Exodus 1. So we'll do that. All right. Thank you all for coming. Have a good